If you want a big punchy impact, try pushing a transient designer into a clipper. Strong transients are one of those things that make a sound jump out of the speaker. This way you get the impression of a big impact even though the transient's been clipped off. An envelope follower is a great way to glue a bunch of layers together where one sound controls the amplitude of all the others. One way to create big impacts, particularly on low-end sounds, is to make lots of space and headroom by having other sounds duck around them. A kick drum, for instance, will briefly push everything down and let that transient pop through. Credit to Ash Reed from PlayStation London for this, and it's an absolute game changer. Maybe the best tip on this list. The super trimmed down version is you have bits that come at the front and back of a sound, almost like the way an animator would ease in and out of an animation. It's like a pre-attack where you lead in and out of a sound and offers you as a sound designer so much more opportunity for working in little details and textures and really telling a story, all without trampling on the real body of the sound. For snappy sounds, break the rules and use hard cuts with no fades. I know, goes against everything that you've been taught, but sometimes it's just exactly what a sound needs to pop. I mean, everywhere. Saturation adds this weight, depth, clarity, and density and just cuts right through everything. There's a sound designer from Sony named Will Files who said that distortion makes things sound cinematic and larger than life, which I completely agree with some caveats. Beware! When you clip your audio, it's technically losing information, specifically transients. If you overcook it, you might turn things mushy and audibly distort them. And that is why it's really good to exaggerate your transients before rounding them off. So what is an appropriate amount to distort and saturate? It really comes down to a matter of taste. One person's too distorted is another's crispy crunchy. But for all that you're losing from saturation, you're also gaining a lot. If this is a pure sine wave, these are the extra harmonics generated, and that's what gives us a full and clear sound. You're literally adding information that was not there before. Especially when you stretch out a sound, you lose a lot of high-end information, and saturation is a perfect way to add some of that back in. I probably should have just made a whole video about saturation. Clean up your low end. I know, you see this tip so much, and you see people arguing about it all the time, whether you should do it or how much you should do it. I think you should do it. Low end eats up so much headroom because it takes a lot of energy to move that stuff through the air, and so many of your sounds have wasted voltage. It's low-end information that you can't even hear. Just make sure to check your balance on some good headphones because like with anything, you can go too far and end up with a sound that has no weight to it. I'm talking about the low, mid, and high balance in a similar way to an orchestral arrangement. So you have sounds that sort of occupy this part of the frequency spectrum, and then sounds that sit here, and ones that sit here. It's like a puzzle. And everybody, for the most part, stays in their own lane. Just like with music, if things are static and sit still too long, our eyes glaze over. Pitch, pan, volume, all those things are parameters we can tune to keep a sound moving over time. Credit to Marshall McGee for this one. I learned it from his YouTube channel. For those cool, over-the-top anime sound effects, try a reverb into a frequency shifter. Again, so at odds with everything that you've learned, in that you kind of think that you're supposed to put a reverb at the end of a signal chain, for the most part. I have ended up using this trick on almost every game that I've worked on, so thank you, Marshall. You can push things forward in a mix by having more high-end and sharper transients. You can push them into the background by doing the opposite, and a good way to push your reverb out of the way is pre-delay. This allows the initial dry signal to shine through while still having a sense of space and credibility. Don't be afraid to layer in synths and other drum sounds to pad out your impacts. The key is to blend them so that they're felt more than heard. Our hearing as human beings, right, you and me, you're a human and I'm most definitely a human from Earth. Our hearing is most sensitive in the 2 to 5K range. The absolute worst grocery store-ass tin can speaker will still preserve the mid-range. Even if you're listening back on a potato If your mix has mid-range compatibility, it'll translate to other systems. So check and see if your low end is perceptibly coming through, even if you cut all the low end out of it.
Psst. Hey kid, the trick is saturation. Again.
You create harmonics above the fundamental and you'll perceive the low end even on crappy speakers. This is the principle behind plugins like Waves R-Bass. Listen back to your mix at really low volumes to get a good picture of how everything is balanced. All of a sudden you might be hyper aware of one thing poking out way more than the others, or certain things not coming through at all. Incidentally, this is a great way to hear the effects of compression too. The way to high-end Sheen is to prep and temper your audio by limiting peaks, whether with high-frequency limiting, clipping, saturation, subtractive EQ, I really like Soothe 2 for that, and then boosting the good stuff that's left over. That's the trick to boosting anything really, I think, is to subtract first. I got this one from Kevin Regami, who worked on Celeste, one of my favorite games, and it's kind of a joke. But it's also not. I mean, my default EQ setting looks like this. 300 Hz is the mud frequency.
Oh, it's very ugly.
And it's true that if you analyze a lot of pro recordings, you will see this area scooped out a lot. It makes things sound muddy. But again, with the caveat that you can overdo it. If you brutally cut all of it out, you end up with something kind of lifeless. So use some caution.
For a big fat bottom,
you can have a sound trigger a gate that opens up and lets a really low sine wave through. It's one of those things, again, that's perceived more than it's heard. That's all, folks. If I think of any more, I will update this. If I learn more things, I will update this and create a new video. Goodbye. I love you, baby boo.
Who's your good boy?